Okay, so welcome to video two, and yeah, let's dive right into it here. So the question is, we're talking about the rising tide of conservatism in the 1970s, in the late 20th century. So what were the roots of the rise of conservatism in the 1970s? Yeah, how do you account for the rise of like the conservative ascendancy in the 1970s? And obviously, this is relevant to your final paper, so pay attention. Okay, so yeah, how do we account for the rise of conservatism beginning around around the 1970s? Well, I think there's different explanations here. So one is that domestic and international troubles in the 1970s made Americans anxious, excuse me, and that functioned to embolden conservatives, right? So Americans' fear over the economy and fear over the state of the war and foreign policy um, emboldened sort of conservative, uh, played into the hands of the conservative point of view, I guess you could say. Economic crisis. The economic crisis perhaps made lower taxes, less government regulation, and social spending cuts to spur business investment seem more appealing. I think that's another explanation. Fears about declining U.S. power led to calls for renewing the Cold War. I guess the last two things I just mentioned, really explain further my first point. So again, my thinking about it, my first point was domestic and international troubles in the 1970s made Americans, fearful, anxious to a certain extent, and then emboldened conservatives. And then, there's a domestic aspect of that with, we have an economic crisis, in many ways, an unprecedented economic crisis, right? Or the kind of economic crisis that most people didn't have any experience with, in the early 1970s. And that economic crisis was increasingly associated with demand side economics and Keynesianism and a large federal state that was all those things were kind of the status quo. And so those that wanted to go in the opposite direction, their perspective was maybe given more credence, given more legitimacy than it perhaps would have otherwise, right? Again, those that wanted to go in the direction of lower taxes and less government regulation, decreasing the size of government, spending cuts, promoting in business investments through lowering the corporate income tax and tax on high income earners, right? So it emboldened those kind of arguments. It strengthened those arguments, right? And again, fear of declining U.S. power, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, et cetera, emboldened those that argued, or you could say emboldened the arguments for renewing the Cold War, for a more aggressive, hawkish, confrontational stance vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. But I think an even bigger factor is the one I'm going to mention next, which is that the civil rights and sexual revolutions produced fears and resentments that eroded the Democratic coalition, and rising urban crime created calls for law and order. So these civil rights and sexual revolutions that are associated with the 1950s, but especially the 1960s and early 1970s. They were associated with the Democratic coalition. But interestingly, like these movements not only emboldened conservatives, but they also broke apart the old New Deal Democratic coalition. And specifically, they created a wedge between the Democratic Party, in many ways, between the Democratic Party on the one hand and working class whites on the other hand. So working class whites started to increasingly support conservative candidates, moved significantly towards Reagan in 1980 and 1984. And a lot of that, I mean, it's different reasons for that, but there's a declining number of Americans and unions. Manufacturing jobs are disappearing rapidly during this time. The union and traditionally union membership in many cases tied working class, and many of them white working class people, and especially men, to the Democratic Party coalition. And so when unions went away, that relationships severed to a large extent. I think the argument can be made. Rising urban crime created calls for law and order. Many of these calls for law and order came from people who used to live in urban areas but had moved to suburban areas, but had experience with what they perceived as a lack of law and order, rising crime rates in urban areas. Another factor here, I think, is the language of individual freedom appealed to lots of different people, but especially to growing numbers of mostly white suburbanites leaving the cities and leaving the cities for suburbs. And the suburbs, become a bastion of modern conservatism. And that's really, so Lisa McGurr's book that you guys are assigned to read, that's related to the final, you're going to use on your final paper, is all about that, right? The rise of conservatism in the suburbs in Orange County, California, specifically. And speaking of Lisa McGurr's suburban warriors, another theme is grassroots conservatism, kitchen table conservatism, right? So not necessarily the elites, the leaders, but the the sort of everyday people who organize small meetings, and those small meetings led to bigger meetings. It put pressure on political candidates and wrote letters and et cetera, and the impact that they had. Conservatives increasingly at the beginning of the 1970s, or even before that, right, organized at the grassroots level and organized to win local elections and take control of local governments. First and foremost, they took control of school boards and other local institution, electoral and other kinds of institutions in order to implement and to successfully enact the conservative policies that they supported. I think it's also important to talk about conservatism in race. This is a little bit complicated, but I think in the 1970s, conservatives smartly abandoned really explicit, overt opposition to the African-American struggle for racial justice that was associated with like the George Wallace presidential campaign. So George Wallace ran for president in 1968 on a really what came to be seen as antiquated, old-fashioned, overtly, explicitly racist appeals, right? And there were lots of other themes, anti-socialism and anti-federal government, but everything was inflected with pretty explicit racism and a desire to throw out essentially most, or if not literally all of the civil rights revolution of the 1960s, including the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So after the 1960s, that was politically untenable. Not to say there weren't people that supported that, supported totally overthrowing the civil rights revolution, but most people did not, and that just wasn't a way to to be elected on a national, or even in most cases on a state level. So yeah, conservatives gave up on that. I think many historians would argue that the appeals to race continued, but they continued in more implied, covert forms. So for example, we'll talk about Reagan coming up here in a few minutes, but so Reagan quite often would talk about welfare queens. And so the welfare queen was, I guess you could say, sort of an archetype of, for lack of a better term, kind of a representative of what had gone wrong with big government liberalism. So that the welfare queen, it was someone who didn't work, even though they were capable of working, but drove a Cadillac and sort of lived this like freewheeling, big spending, lifestyle off of the government dole, the government cheese, right, and sort of the inherent unfairness of that. So yeah, that's not a new idea necessarily, but Reagan would, in his descriptions, would often say, this person would make references to, she lives in an urban area in a city and she drives a Cadillac. It was inflicted with racial overtones, so that even though he wasn't saying the person is African American, that was clearly the implication of it, right? So that's the myth of the quote welfare queen, right? So that is a change, right? From, it's not overtly racist appeals. But there's, a lot of historians would argue still a racial, a white identitarian element to conservative politics, I guess you could say, in the 1970s, even though it's transformed to a certain extent. I think also, so one important subset of conservatives were the so-called neoconservatives. So neoconservatives were a group of mostly former Democrats, I guess they would call themselves liberals or former liberals, who turned against the federal government and liberalism after the upheavals of the 1960s, citing a decline in moral standards and respect for authority. Many neoconservatives wanted to end welfare. They wanted to decrease taxes and regulation, increase the size of the federal government, which had gotten unwieldy. And more than anything, they wanted to return to an aggressive, hawkish stance towards the Soviet Union and towards conducting the Cold War. And Reagan was sort of their vessel, excuse me, their way of doing that. And also we see, you can't talk about the roots of the rise of conservatism in the 1970s without talking about the rise of the religious right. So the rise of religious fundamentalism in the 1970s significantly expanded conservatism's base. Religious fundamentalism throughout most of American history has been associated with, conservatism more than liberalism. It depends on how you define conservatism and liberalism a little bit, but so, religious fundamentalists supporting conservatives, leaning towards conservatives maybe isn't unprecedented, but the degree to which religious fundamentalists and just in religious people in general religion basically became politicized, the degree to which religion and politics were connected and were used to support one particular political party and political coalition. The Republican Party and Republican, conservative coalition were to a large extent unprecedented. And a lot of this movement came out of evangelical churches as opposed to like mainstream Protestant denominations. So especially in suburbs in the South and West, evangelical churches became increasingly associated with, and explicitly align themselves with right-wing politics. What accounts for this upsurge in energy among the religious right? Let me just see. Yeah, so here we're going to talk about the religious right, the Equal Rights Amendment, the battle over the Equal Rights Amendment, and the abortion controversy. But yeah, continuing on with the religious right. So yeah, what accounts for this upsurge in energy among the religious right beginning in like the 1970s? Well, so evangelical Christians, were increasingly alienated from a culture that they perceived as, discounting religion, promoting immorality. So what did these, evangelical Christians, right-leaning Christians want? Well, they had specific, policy demands. One of them was they almost all supported the reversal of Supreme Court decisions that really three Supreme Court it's three Supreme Court decisions in particular is what I'm trying to say. So the decision, I believe in the 1960s, to ban prayer in public schools. They were vociferously opposed to that and wanted that overturned. The decision protecting pornography as free speech, or what they saw as pornography as free speech, they wanted that overturned as well. And probably more than anything else, a major animator of the conservative right in the late 20th century was the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973 that legalized abortion, that was recently overturned by the Supreme Court. So this, we're getting into a lot of political issues or a lot of history that's relevant to contemporary politics here. Also in 1979, Jerry Falwell, Virginia minister, created a group called the Moral Majority. And the purpose of the Moral Majority, according to Falwell, was to wage a war against sin and elect, quote, pro-life, pro-family, pro-America, end quote, candidates. And Falwell, explicitly labeled supporters of like abortion rights, what he saw as easy divorce, and also reduced defense budgets. Anyone who supported those things were agents of Satan, according to align themselves with Satan, according to Falwell, and were trying essentially to undermine God's plans for the great nation of the United States. But Christian conservatives seem most angered, and this fits into what I said a few minutes ago, more than anything, they were angered by the sexual revolution. The changes wrought by the sexual revolution. They saw this revolution as an immoral threat to traditional families. The religious right thought that the 1960s had turned freedom essentially into moral anarchy, right? For example, singer Anita Bryant helped pass an anti-gay ordinance under the banner "Save Our Children." And let's talk about the battle over the ERA as well. Let me just see something here. Did I not turn this on? Oh, there we go. Okay. I had this feeling that I wasn't recording, but it looks like I am recording. Okay, let's talk about the ERA. ERA stands for Equal Rights Amendment. And here's kind of the background. So the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment goes back to really the 1920s. And so, yeah, an equal rights amendment to the Constitution. The idea is to amend the Constitution to affirm the quote equality of rights under the law. Affirm that equality of rights under the law could not be abridged on account of sex, end quote. That was kind of the idea. So this was a gender equality, a constitutional amendment that was proposed that related to gender equality, right? And again, the idea was to affirm equal rights under the law and affirm that these equal rights under the law could not be abridged on account of gender or sex, right? So this was first proposed among second-wave feminists in the 1920s. So fast forward to the 1970s. So in the 1970s, family values became central to conservative politics, most prominently in the fight over the Equal Rights Amendment that was brought up as a part of an extension of sort of the second-wave feminist women's movement of the 1970s. So the ERA, was revived by second-wave feminists in the 1970s, and in fact passed Congress. So this proposal to change the Constitution to affirm equality of rights under the law could not be abridged on account of sex. It was basically approved by Congress uncontroversially and overwhelmingly in 1972 and sent to the states for ratification. But when it was sent to the states, it faced an unexpected conservative backlash, right? So it sparked protests from those who believed it would discredit the role of wife and homemaker. And the Equal Rights Amendment revealed divisions among women as well. And really these divisions came down to different definitions of freedom, I would say, right? So the ERA supporters defined women's freedom as basically freedom in the public sphere. So to second-wave feminists and ERA supporters more generally, freedom was freedom. Women's freedom was freedom in the public sphere, freedom from employment discrimination or supporting your right to be employed where you choose, to not be abridged by obscured by employment discrimination on the basis of sex or gender. But the ERA's opponents define freedom for women according to their roles as wives and mothers. They define freedom in the private sphere, right? Opponents claim that the amendment would erode male breadwinner support for wives. And that it was intended, they basically claim that it was intended to get all women, regardless, into the workforce, regardless of if that was they felt was their true calling or not, and in opposition to those that deliberately and consciously chose to be mothers and homemakers. So though polls show that most male and female Americans supported the Equal Rights Amendment, it actually did not, because of the conservative backlash, it didn't achieve the required ratification of 38 states in order to become law. And that brings us to the battle over abortion rights. So yeah, a movement to reverse Roe v. Wade started among Roman Catholics, but soon included evangelical Protestants and social conservatives as well. And so pro-life activists insisted that liberals were spreading sexual immorality at the cost of moral values. The movement insisted that life began at conception and abortion was essentially tantamount to murder. And by the way, so Roe v. Wade, and I don't really want to get into this too much, but the Roe v. Wade decision, and I believe 1973 Supreme Court decision, basically legalized essentially first trimester abortions, and in all 50 states, right? So different states could erode abortion rights, kind of in other restrict abortions in other ways. And people would argue that states indeed and localities even went beyond the restrictions of or the guarantees of Roe v. Wade, and chipped away at Roe v. Wade itself. But anyway, so that's what pro-life, the nascent pro-life movement was responding to. Feminists, on the other hand, argued that a woman's right to control her own body includes the right to safe legal abortions. Importantly and interestingly, I would say, if you think about it, both sides, the pro-life and pro-choice movement, had a commonality here, which is they both spoke the language of the rights revolution. They both appealed to the broader American public and made their case. They tried to persuade people on the basis of rights, rights-based rhetoric, right? So they showed how this showed how the rights revolution had reshaped political language. Yeah, as opponents of abortion appealed for the right to life, while supporters claimed and celebrated the right to choose. And so what are the effects of the rising anti-abortion movement? Well, I would say it had a lot of effects, a lot of consequences. The anti-abortion movement successfully pressured Congress, actually over Republican President Gerald Ford's veto, to end federal funding for abortions for poor women, the Medicaid program. And by the 1990s, there was a movement of more extreme anti-abortion activists to bomb medical clinics, to assassinate doctors who terminated pregnancies. So these were kind of the fruits of the pro-life movement. Okay, some of the fruits of the pro-life movement. Yeah, and so that picture there is Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly. She was she's most famous for her opposition to the ERA, actually. So she was prominent in the anti-ERA movement. And this is kind of the other side, Women's Liberation March. And that's an anti-abortion rally on the steps of the U.S. Capitol. Excuse me. And others, protesting in support of abortion rights, opposing the pro-life movement. Okay, let's talk about conservatism. Conservatism and economics. Conservatism and economics. So, and when you're going to talk about conservatism and economics, really, you have to talk about conservatism and the American West. So the American West has always both reflected and contributed to national trends. And the 1970s is an especially relevant or prominent example of that. So beginning in the 1970s, the so-called Sun Belt, the American West, was fertile ground for strands of conservatism. Many transplants to California brought their evangelical Christianity and their growing disdain for the rights revolution with them when they migrated to places like California. They embraced an anti-tax model for the Republican Party led by Californians such as Richard Nixon and eventually Ronald Reagan. Let me talk about the anti-tax part of this in Prop 13. So in 1978, conservatives ran a successful campaign in California to ban further increases in property taxes and demonstrated the power of anti-tax politics. And this was Proposition 13. So that was Proposition 13 was a ballot initiative that was passed in California in 1978. I have personal experience with this. I'm from California. I used to be a homeowner in California before I moved to Arizona. So Prop 13, even to this day, is a big deal in California. It was a big change. Let me get into this a little bit. So what did Prop 13 change? What's kind of relevant here? Well, basically, Prop 13 made the maximum amount of any tax on real property, or stated, made it the law where the maximum amount of any ad valorem tax, basically tax on real property, could not exceed 1% of the full cash value of such property. So property taxes were capped at 1% of the assessed value of the property. And then even more interestingly, I think, is the second part. So Prop 13 declared property taxes were to be assessed by their 1976 value. Remember, this was 1978, so they were supposed to go back to their 1976 value. And even more importantly, restricted annual increases of the tax to an inflation factor not to exceed 2% per year. A reassessment of the property tax, according to Prop 13, could only be made when A, the property ownership changes, or B, there is construction done. So it caps property taxes at a maximum of 1%. The estimated value of the property, and it can only go up. It can go up no more than 2%. It can increase only by 2% per year. And there's exceptions to that. The exceptions are property ownership changes and when there's construction done. So this passed overwhelmingly among the California electorate. I think 2/3 voted for it, roughly. And the idea here is that homeowners in California certainly had many of them had a gripe. So many of them had bought in to the California real estate market, had purchased their, in most cases, single-family homes in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s at bargain basement prices, right? And many of these people were middle, low-income people. And what had happened was the property values had skyrocketed, so good for them. But every year they were getting hit with, if the assessed property value was 15% higher than it had been the previous year, which wasn't necessarily uncommon during this time with California's boom in population and boom in industry and economic growth in places like Los Angeles and Orange County and the San Francisco Bay Area and San Diego. Basically increases in property values, and almost instantly they would get huge increases in property taxes. So you could see why many homeowners supported this. And at the same time, there were undoubtedly negative effects to Prop 13, right? So the big winners undoubtedly were businesses and homeowners, but also, so the law benefited businesses and homeowners, but also cut funds for schools, libraries, and other public services. And anti-tax sentiment flourished throughout the nation, and other states passed similar laws during this time. That's another reason I wanted to spend a few minutes on this, is that, there were other anti-tax bills in other states, and many of them passed during this time. And so this is known as the era of sort of the conservative tax revolt. And Prop 13 sort of, in many ways, was at the vanguard of this, sort of anti-tax revolution. But yeah, what happened in California was that not surprisingly, right, this dramatically reduced public revenue. And that had effects for, services that people relied upon, first and foremost, schools, right? So California schools were among the most well-funded until Prop 13, and I believe after Prop 13 were, at least in terms of state support for public schools, were significantly lacking, and I think in the bottom 10 or bottom 5 of U.S. states pretty consistently after that, right? And so individual school districts in many cases turn to local taxes to make up for this, right? So that, if you're assessing, like local property taxes, you're going to get a lot more money in, areas that are wealthy than you are in areas that are middle class or especially poor areas, right? And this leads to massive inequality between different schools and different neighborhoods, right? So kind of the different aspects of the tax revolt played out in California, were epitomized in California, I would say. Another important thing to talk about here is the Sagebrush Rebellion. The Sagebrush Rebellion. So new environmental regulations spark calls for less government regulation in the economy, especially in the West, where the quote-unquote Sagebrush Rebellion sought to reduce federal bureaucracy's control over and conservation of the region's land and resources. So the roots of this so-called Sagebrush Rebellion really went all the way back to the 1920s, when the U.S. Forest Service attempted to increase grazing fees and mineral rights in national forests and other public lands. So Westerners who believed who believed they were being hurt by these environmental regulations, they believe that environmental regulations were closing the public domain to resource extraction that was potentially lucrative, and it was helpful for the economy and for industry. Most of these people supported the conservative movement, supported the conservative cause, the Republican Party, and increasingly were behind Ronald Reagan in the presidential campaign of 1980. Using the language of freedom from tyranny, leaders in Western states embraced states' rights. Well, the Sagebrush Rebellion had few concrete accomplishments. It did underscore the rising tide of anti-government sentiment, right? Local and individual private control over the resources of the West, the land, basically, of the West. And the shrinking of government, especially the federal government or even the state government, right? That Prop 13 represented. The connection between these is a rising tide of anti-government, anti-state sentiment. By 1980, back to President Carter, Carter was deeply unpopular. Conservatism seemed to be on the rise everywhere. Ironically, Carter was conservative in many ways, especially compared to the Democratic Party, especially in economic policy. But that wasn't enough to save him. By the way, when we talk about the rising tide of conservatism in the late 20th century, we're not just talking about the United States. This also happened in places like England. So in England, right around the time Ronald Reagan was elected, Margaret Thatcher became prime minister, and she promised to, among other things, sell state-owned industries to private firms. She promised to decrease the welfare state, to reduce taxes, and to fight the unions, right? In the United States, Ronald Reagan's campaign for the presidency united conservatives around promises to end stagflation and restore America's confidence in its role in the world. Reagan also appealed to white backlash, the extent to which whites, especially whites in suburbs and rural areas, were uncomfortable with the civil rights revolution of the 1960s and 1970s. And Reagan voiced support for states' rights. He vilified, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, welfare recipients. He condemned busing and affirmative action. By the way, busing was an issue, if you don't know, that was related to schools. And the amount of, basically, in many cases, to promote school integration, the integration of different students from different races and ethnic backgrounds, and classes who lived in different parts of a certain, urban locale, a certain area. The idea was to, in many cases, more than anything, bus lower income students who were disproportionately African American and minority to quote unquote white schools, which were more well funded, to give them more of an opportunity and to increase integration in the public schools. And that provoked a fierce backlash, even in places like in the North, like Boston, Massachusetts, right? And that many conservative organizations and politicians got their start actually in the anti-busing movement. So just to talk about that for a second. Let's see. Also, Reagan got a lot of support from family values, religious conservatives, right? Interestingly, it was interesting because Reagan was not particularly devout and was also a divorcee, right? Had been divorced, but religious conservatives supported him. This might sound familiar. Religious conservatives overwhelmingly supporting Donald Trump, who has been divorced twice and isn't known for his piety, isn't known as being particularly devout, committed to religious devotion, right? Whatever you think of him, I think pretty much everyone would agree on that, right? So anyway, a lot of parallels actually with Ronald Reagan. So Reagan beat Carter in 1980 by a landslide. He took former Democratic bastions like Illinois and Texas and New York and turned them to the Republican side. And Carter received only 41% of the popular vote. Carter, interestingly, went on to lead anti-poverty, human rights, and diplomatic efforts around the world. And these, in many ways, are seen as like the great achievements of his career. Well, his presidency is considered by most to be, in many ways, a failure. And his defeat is seen as essentially launching, like he more than anything played a role in launching the Reagan Revolution and the conservative ascendancy of the 1980s, which made freedom the domain of the right. And put conservatives, gave advantage to conservative arguments and put liberals increasingly on the defensive throughout, I think most people would argue, the rest of the 20th century. Okay, so, what did I do here? Let's talk more about Reagan. That's a Reagan supporter in 1980. This is the 1980 presidential election. So Reagan got 91% of the electoral vote, 51% of the popular vote. So he beat Carter by a whopping 10% of the popular vote. That's pretty significant, especially in modern American politics. So yeah, this was basically a wipeout victory. Okay, so let's talk about the Reagan Revolution and more about Reagan. How did the Reagan presidency affect American aims at home and abroad? That's the focus question. How did the Reagan presidency affect American aims at home and abroad? Okay, so let's talk about Reagan's path to the presidency, Reagan's roots. Where did he come from? How did he come to political prominence? So Reagan, interestingly, was originally a New Deal Democrat. He was actually head of the Screen Actors Guild, so he was an actor. That was his profession. He was kind of like a famous B-movie actor. And he was head of the Screen Actors Guild, right? Essentially a New Deal Democrat. But this changed in the 1950s when he became the spokesman for General Electric, and he began preaching the virtues of unregulated, laissez-faire free market capitalism, interestingly. And yeah, Reagan, famously declared that like Social Security was tantamount to socialism and was the end of freedom in the United States. So he shifted dramatically to a very hard right political orientation in the 1950s, all the way back to the 1950s, even though he began as a New Deal Democrat. Okay, so another important data point in Reagan's political rise is his nominating speech for Barry Goldwater in 1964. So the Goldwater campaign went down in flames, but Reagan didn't go down in flames with them. He raised his political profile among conservatives, his conservative bona fides, so to speak, with his 1964 Republican convention speech and his support for Barry Goldwater. He was elected California's governor in 1966 and was at the vanguard in many ways of the backlash to the perceived excesses of the 1960s, the perceived excesses of like the leftist student movements in places like UC Berkeley. Reagan took sort of a hard line on law and order, crime, anti-crime, personal responsibility, et cetera, as California governor. And in 1976, he challenged Ford for the Republican nomination and almost won. And his victory in the 1980 election brought together really old and new conservatives, right? So what explains Reagan's political success? Well, again, he brought together old and new conservatives, and even more than that, Reagan appealed to all different kinds of conservatives, right? He brought people into the coalition. He broadened the conservative coalition, you could say, right? So who did he appeal to? Well, he appealed to different parts of the conservative coalition. He appealed to Sunbelt suburbanites, definitely, on taxes, on religious, traditionalism, shrinking the size of government. He also appealed to urban working class ethnics, those many of them in the Northeast and Upper Midwest. And many of them had been New Deal Democrats who were increasingly alienated from the race and gender and sexual revolutions of the 1960s and 1970s and associated the Democratic Party with those revolutions and liberals with those revolutions. And many of them, increasingly supported Reagan in 1980 and became more reliable conservative, more reliable part of the conservative coalition. And they're becoming more non-union as well, not existing within the context of unionized work. Unionized manufacturing work played a role in that as well. Their drift to the conservative coalition. But also Reagan appealed to anti-government crusaders, right? Basically libertarian conservatives, Milton Friedmanites, and aggressive cold warriors as well, neoconservatives, and libertarians. He appealed to the Christian right. To go along with it. So it was really a broad-based appeal. Although Reagan, the oldest man to ever serve as president, was often underestimated by his opponents, he was pretty politically experienced by the time he became president, and he was certainly a gifted public speaker. And he had conveyed a sense, many people felt a sense of optimism and good humor that appealed to many Americans. His was a very sunny, optimistic conservatism. He made many people thought conservative seem almost progressive, right? So really it was liberals and Democrats who were the party of the old and the antiquated, the big bloated federal bureaucracy. And conservatives were the party of the South and the West, the Sun Belt, these new regions of the country that were, at least up until recent years, economic booming, economic boom towns, right? Economic boom areas. Let's see. He also reiterated themes of America's mission to be an example of freedom in the world that had origins in the American Revolution, and even went back even further to the idea, which I believe comes from John Winthrop, of America being a shining city on a hill, a shining example of freedom and self-government. Which after the revolution was interpreted as, in many cases, America being a shining example of liberty, self-government, democracy. Reagan picked up on those themes and used them for his own purposes, right? Okay, let's talk about, oh, sorry, that was the slide I should have put up there. So that's what we just talked about Reagan, how he was underestimated by his opponents. He made conservatism seem progressive. He took control of the public debate and seemed pragmatic. And this is a picture of Reagan, I believe, as a spokesman for General Electric. Okay, let's talk about the economy and labor of Ronald Reagan. economic policies, labor policies. So Reagan's definition let's talk about, how did Reagan define economic freedom? How did Reagan define economic freedom? Well, Reagan wanted to reduce union power. He thought reducing the power of labor unions would increase economic freedom. He thought dismantling regulations would as well increase economic freedom. And he was also in favor of radically reducing taxes, and especially taxes on upper income individuals, on the wealthy. So in 1981 and 1986, Reagan won tax reforms from Congress that dramatically reduced taxes for the wealthy and moved America away from the idea of progressive graduated income taxes that had been associated with the mid 20th century and sort of the New Deal, Great Society, liberal dominance of national politics. Reagan also appointed conservatives to lead regulatory agencies, and these conservatives often sought to gut those agencies, for lack of a better term, reduce environmental and workplace safety regulations opposed by business. Many of these appointees were aligned with business interests as opposed to like environmental groups, right? For example, Reagan promoted believed strongly in trickle-down economics. Let me talk about this for a second. So liberals, since the New Deal, had tried to push economic growth by using their theory of promoting economic growth was to use government power, the power of the federal government, to raise Americans' purchasing power. And this is called demand-side economics, or Keynesianism, named after the famous economist John Maynard Keynes. So Keynesianism, or demand-side economics, right? The idea is to use government power to raise America's purchasing power. So especially with recessions or depressions, the idea is to increase government spending, to sort of prime the pump, get money flowing in the economy, right? Keeping people employed when otherwise they would have lost their jobs, and that's going to keep consumer spending at a reasonable level, or even increasing, and that's going to get us out of recessions. And that's the idea behind Keynesianism, essentially. So Reagan believed not in demand side economics but supply side economics, right? Also known, at least by opponents of supply side economics, as, quote, trickle down economics, right? And this form of this economic philosophy relied on high interest rates to curb inflation and lower tax rates for businesses and the wealthy to stimulate private investment. So supply side economics, I should say, assume that cutting taxes would make Americans at all income levels work harder because they would keep more of what they had earned, and that everyone would benefit from increased business profits and a growing economy, which would raise government revenues despite lowering taxes. Yeah, so a big part of supply side economics is the idea that you decrease corporate income taxes, you decrease taxes of wealthy people, and they're the people who are in a position to invest and create new business opportunities that are going to employ people, right? And we're going to see job growth and wage growth as a result of that. And so in that sense, trickle down economics is essentially, that's accurate. Whether that was intended as an epithet or not, a pejorative or not, that's an accurate description of the philosophy, for better or for worse. So Reagan also began an era of hostility between government and labor unions. So this was epitomized by, in 1981, his firing of the air traffic controllers after they went on strike. So in 1981, members of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, or PADCO, the main air traffic controllers union, went on strike in defiance of federal law. And so Reagan fired them for going on strike. So he fired them all and used the military, at least temporarily, to supervise air traffic until new controllers could be trained. And this set the anti-union tone for Reagan and for the 1980s more generally. This set a significant precedent. Anti-union precedent. So Reagan's treatment of the air traffic controllers, again, set a tone of anti-unionism in the 1980s. Reagan inspired many employers to launch anti-union offenses, and more businesses now hired workers to permanently replace those who had gone on strike. Manufacturing employment during this time also continued its decline, but of course that had begun before Reagan's presidency, but it continued under Reagan's presidency to a large extent. And this functioned to further reduce the strength of unions, reduce the number of people in a number of workers in labor unions, right? By the time Reagan left office, the service and retail sectors employed more Americans than manufacturing. So America increasingly was becoming a service economy as opposed to a manufacturing economy. And importantly, only 11% of non-governmental workers were union members. So really beginning with Reagan, and this continues up to the present day, to the extent people are in labor unions, they're in public sector labor unions as opposed to private sector labor unions. So teachers, I think most teachers are in labor unions, other government employees, people who work in federal or state bureaucracy, or have labor unions, but those are public sector, not private sector employees, right? So that's a big change. So what were the fruits of Reaganomics? What were the consequences? Well, as critics call the administration's policies, Reaganomics, they call them Reaganomics, right? So what were the effects of Reaganomics? Initially, America saw the most severe recession since the 1930s, but a long period of economic expansion followed the recession of the first couple of years of the Reagan administration. As employers reduced their workforces and they shifted their production overseas, they used new technologies, business success and profits stabilized and even increased. Businesses increasingly into the mid and especially as we get into the late 1980s, businesses became more profitable. The stock market rose for the most part. Simultaneously, inflation dropped dramatically, in part because of greater oil production. The stock market rose, as I mentioned a second ago, and despite a short drop in 1987, continued to climb as things got closer to the 1990s. Okay, let's talk about criticisms of the Reagan Revolution. Actually, before I do that, here's the air traffic controllers on strike in 1981. Here's the ruins of a steel plant representing, kind of epitomizing the hollowing out of, basically deindustrialization of the American economy. Homelessness increased during the Reagan presidency as well. Supports for, public supports, social safety net programs decreased. Okay, so let's talk about criticisms. I'm going to skip this part, actually. Wait, actually, hold on. Okay, yeah, let's talk about criticisms of the Reagan Revolution. Here we go. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about conservatives and Reagan, what Reagan delivered on for conservatives and what maybe he didn't deliver on as much. Let's talk about the wars on crime and drugs, which are an interesting part of the Reagan administration and sort of the Reagan era of the 1980s and the conservative ascendancy, and also Reagan and the Cold War is important here as well. So it's important to point out that in some ways Reagan disappointed conservatives. So his administration sharply reduced programs such as food stamps and school lunches. At the same time, it left intact core elements of the welfare state. For example, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid all remained essentially intact following, during, and after Reagan's presidency. Reagan also delivered very little for the religious right. So abortion remained legal in the 1980s. Women continued to enter the labor force in increasingly large numbers, right? And Reagan appointed actually the first female member of the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor, who was from the great state of Arizona, by the way. And in many ways, she disappointed conservatives by being more independent as opposed to being a sort of reliable conservative vote on presence on the court. Reagan voiced support as well for a constitutional amendment that would allow prayer in public schools, but that actually didn't go anywhere. Nancy Reagan, the first lady, launched a Just Say No campaign against illegal drug use, right? But this failed to stop the crack and cheap, the spread of crack and cheap cocaine, cheap form of cocaine, in urban areas. So this was seen as a failed a largely failed initiative, right? Reagan did very little to halt affirmative action as well. In terms of the war on crime and the war on drugs, which I just kind of spoke to, so if Reagan weakened the federal government's power to regulate business, it's important to point out that he strengthened the government's power, the state's power in other ways, and specifically he strengthened the state's power in the role of crime control, right? So Reagan built on initiatives begun during the Nixon administration. He included increased spending on policing and law enforcement, and an expansion of the nation's prisons. In 1973, Nixon had declared an all-out war on the global drug menace. So Nixon started this, quote, famous war on drugs in 1873, but initially really didn't make any headway, didn't really get a whole lot of results. So Reagan took up and continued and tried to expand what Nixon had started in 1973. And so Reagan expanded on Nixon's quote unquote, tough on crime approach. For example, Reagan and conservatives passed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984 that reinstated the federal death penalty, abolished the federal parole system, and also instituted harsher sentencing guidelines for judges to implement. Public fears about the spread of crack in urban areas contributed to support for these punitive policies. Reagan brought national spending on criminal justice to a record high of $3.5 billion as well. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, passed in 1986, led to a surge of arrests and rapidly expanded the prison population, mostly among African American and young Hispanic men, who were disproportionately targeted by police. So this is a big issue all the way up to the present day, and it has roots back at the Reagan era, undoubtedly. But again, the war on drugs largely failed to make a dent in the global supply chain or the domestic of drugs, right? And the domestic demand for drugs. Reagan and the Cold War. Let's talk about Reagan and the Cold War. So Reagan vigorously denounced the Soviet Union as a, quote, evil empire and started the largest military buildup in U.S. history, including long-range bombers and missiles. This is in his first administration, the first years of his presidency. He also pressed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, into deploying short-range nuclear weapons in Europe. And the renewed arms race and Reagan's talk of winning a nuclear war functioned to spread alarm and fear around the world. In the early 1980s, a mass movement in the United States and Europe called for a nuclear freeze on into nuclear arms development. So Reagan sought to end sort of the détente with the Soviet Union and take an aggressive, hawkish stance towards the Soviet Union and conduct of the Cold War. Early in his presidency, he also sought to end America's reluctance to commit U.S. forces overseas, the result of the Vietnam War, the failures of the Vietnam War. So Reagan sent troops to invade Grenada, a tiny Caribbean island, to remove a pro-Castro government that was part of preventing the spread of communism, right? He bombed Libya to retaliate against that government's alleged involvement in a terrorist attack in West Berlin. And in 1982, he sent Marines to Lebanon to keep the peace in a civil war, but quickly withdrew them after a bomb exploded at a U.S. barracks, killing 241 Americans. So under Reagan, the country also became closer to anti-communist dictatorships in Chile and South Africa. His administration sent money and arms to governments in El Salvador and Guatemala, whose armies and associated death squads committed atrocities against civilian opponents. So Reagan was less concerned about human rights and was more concerned about hawkishness with regards to the Cold War, confronting the Soviet Union head-on, military buildup, in general, and stopping the spread of communism wherever it was potentially rearing its ugly head, so to speak, right? Let's see. Let's talk about Reagan as more about Reagan as Cold Warrior. So yeah, Reagan as Cold Warrior, the Iran-Contra affair. This is one of the big stains in the Reagan presidency. So U.S. involvement in Central America created the great scandal of Reagan's presidency, the Iran-Contra affair, known as the Iran-Contra affair. So in 1984, Congress banned military aid to the Contras. those in Nicaragua fighting the Sandinistas, who in 1979 had ousted the US-backed dictator Somoza. And in 1985, Reagan secretly authorized the sale of arms to Iran, then engaged in a war with Iraq, the Iran-Iraq War, in order to get the release of American hostages held by Islamic groups in the Middle East. But the director of the Central Intelligence Agency and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the NSC, National Security Council, diverted funds from the arms sale to buy military supplies for the Contras in defiance of Congress. And the idea was to support the Contras, who were an anti-communist organization. So word of this got out, and the scheme was exposed by the media in 1987, and Congress held televised hearings that showed lying and violations of the law that were called the Nixon era. 11 members of Reagan's administration were convicted of perjury or destroying documents or pled guilty before they were tried. Reagan acknowledged or denied knowledge of the scheme, but the affair, damaged, his credibility. Undoubtedly damaged his public credibility and the public's confidence in him. And importantly, with regards to the Cold War, Reagan changed and really softened his stance in many ways in his second administration towards towards foreign policy, and specifically towards the Soviet Union, and in many ways played a role in ending the Cold War. Now, the Cold War didn't officially end until the George H.W. Bush administration in 1989, in many ways the conservative Republican successor to Reagan. But Reagan kind of got things started. So Reagan and Gorbachev, Reagan's presidency showed the contradictions. Get my wrong notes here. So surprisingly, Reagan in his second term softened his anti-communist rhetoric and established good relations with Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev had come to power in 1985 and wanted to reform the Soviet Union's political system, and this was known as Glasnost. And he also wanted to reinvigorate the economy by establishing some market principles, and that was known as perestroika. So kind of the reasons for that, these changes, these suggested changes by Gorbachev, was that the USSR had fallen behind the United States economically in terms of production and distribution of consumer goods, and was really relying on imports, which left it geopolitically vulnerable. And this really, in many ways, facilitated the attempts at Glasnost and perestroika, politically opening up and economically opening up, free markets and free trade and freedom to a certain extent, at least little by little was the idea. Gorbachev realized that the reforms he wanted required cuts in military costs. Reagan was ready to negotiate, and they held a series of talks on arms control that concluded with agreements on reducing weapon stockpiles. So that was an achievement for Reagan. In 1988, Gorbachev, furthermore, began withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. So that was a win for the United States as well. And Reagan, despite starting his presidency as a Cold Warrior, all things considered, left office really pursuing policies that in many ways repudiated his earlier militant anti-Soviet stance. So it's really a softening of Reagan's Cold War and policies and foreign policy. Okay, let's talk about the legacies of the Reagan Revolution. Last thing I want to get to here, legacies of the Reagan Revolution. So Reagan's presidency showed the contradictions of modern conservatism, I think, in many ways. And this is a theme. This is a significant theme of the McGurr book. So you might want to kind of think about this. But, Reagan wanted to appeal to the religious right. Though he wanted to appeal to the religious right, the Reagan Revolution undermined traditional and conservative values by inspiring speculation, business mergers, and investors to pursue profits at the cost of, plant closings and job losses and devastated communities. Yeah, so the idea here is that there's a contradiction between the two schools of conservatism, the conservative ascendancy in the late 20th century, and especially the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s. And the idea is that, on the one hand, economic conservatism, which became associated with sort of free market, unregulated capitalism, freedom in the economic sphere. So we have that on the one hand, but also the religious right and appeal towards traditionalism, the importance of, family values. And the problem is that, I think it could be argued that unregulated capitalism led in many ways to, unregulated capitalism in the late 20th century destabilized tradition in many ways, in many communities. It hollowed out many communities. It led to the destabilization of the family, right? People, especially men, used to have steady, well-paid jobs with benefits, and these were even many of them people who didn't go to college, right? And capitalism, for better or for worse, along with other changes in the economy and changes in technology and et cetera, have destabilize that situation. And, I think a lot of people would argue, I would certainly argue that, again, it's local traditions, family stability has been undermined in numerous ways as a result of laissez-faire capitalism, largely, unregulated or at least deregulated capitalism. So there's a contradiction between those two things, and I think that continues to affect this contradiction of the conservative movement. I think continues to affect our politics and society and culture even to this day. Excuse me. Should also be noted that because of Iran-Contra and also because of huge deficits, I didn't really talk about this, but yeah, Reagan, cut taxes and reduced some spending, but also built up the military, which, increased spending of the military. So this had the net effect of not reducing deficits, but increasing budget deficits and increasing the national debt, right? So all of these things left Reagan in many ways with a tarnished reputation upon leaving office in 1989. Same time, and it has to be admitted that few figures have so decisively shaped American politics, right? So if you think about Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, he ran for president in 1988 and defeated liberal Democrat Michael Dukakis, who was the governor of Massachusetts. And the way he beat Dukakis was by tarring and feathering Dukakis as a liberal. So liberal became an epithet. It became a pejorative, right? If you're a liberal, if you're seen as a liberal, it's hard to get elected, right? And that was a function of the conservative ascendancy of the late 20th century, and especially of the political success of Reagan. Conservative ideas about the virtues of free markets and the evils of big government dominated the media and debates during this time. Democrats and liberals were put in the defensive. Those receiving public aid were increasingly not seen as unfortunate or down in their luck. But we're seen as a burden increasingly on taxpayers, right? And this is an old theme in American society and American politics, differentiating between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And that theme was revived significantly during the Reagan Revolution, and I think continues in many ways to this day. Also, the Democratic president of the 1990s, Bill Clinton, so we did have, 1990s was dominated as far as the executive branch by Democrats, with Bill Clinton winning in 1992 initially and then getting reelected in 1996. But Bill Clinton came out of the sort of conservative, sort of new Democrat. He fashioned himself as a new type of Democrat. He famously declared in a speech to Congress that the era of big government is over. In many ways he passed welfare reform, for example. He was tough on crime, the 1994 crime bill. So in many ways, even though Clinton's a Democrat and Reagan was a Republican, these were continuations in many ways of the Reagan Revolution, or they at least reflected political realignment in the late 20th century United States. Okay, so let's go in there. Hopefully that's helpful. And I think hopefully that should be especially helpful. What I talked about in this video should be especially helpful for your final paper in contextualizing the McGurr book about grassroots conservatism in Orange County. Okay, so let's go ahead and end there and see you later.